It goes by many names: China White, tar, mud, dream stick. It comes in many forms: morphine, heroin, codeine, fentanyl, tramadol. It's essential to our survival as a neurotransmitter. It drives us and motivates us when naturally present in our bodies, but it is too easily abused and too potent for consumption normally. It's been with humankind for thousands of years, yet each year still more fall victim to it. Since Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971, the West has been adamant on regulating and controlling it. Yet not more than 2 centuries ago, it was the West that funded a war for this very drug. The story of the Opium Wars is a convoluted one, ripe with hypocrisy and corruption between two formidable empires, China and Great Britain, who greatly misunderstood each other. But it is too often simplified as the story of Western imperialism or trade negotiations. Its chaotic nature is indicative of the way humankind has long grappled with drugs. Drugs are in many ways quintessential to our culture, but so are they to the propagation of our worst vices, not merely in consumption but also in distribution. Opium had long been a commodity in the Far East. Arab traders introduced the Tang dynasty to the opium poppy in the 8th century. It was used as an aphrodisiac among other medicinal and recreational purposes, and as Zhu Bowling records, its price rivaled that of gold. But opium is no gold, it's a drug meant to be consumed, like alcohol or coffee. Unlike those, usage of opium and its derivative heroin carry a negative deviant connotation. Yet simultaneously, other opioids such as fentanyl are seen as necessary painkillers, and morphine, the primary psychoactive compound, is listed on World Health Organization's list of essential medicines. This dissonant societal view on opium stems in large part due to the extreme power of opioids. Its power stems from its ability to induce an acute state of euphoria, which can be used to treat pain from a wide variety of conditions, whether as an analgesic or an anesthetic. Of course, the danger comes with unwanted side effects, namely nausea, hallucinations, drowsiness, and low blood pressure. Perhaps most importantly, it hooks the user on a physical dependence loop, where withdrawal leads to increasingly dire symptoms. Even after physical dependence disappears, psychological dependence remains, leading many to relapse back into use. But what modern science has uncovered about this potent narcotic was not known to the Chinese, and so it was casually used recreationally to kill pain and cure boredom. With the advent of the Enlightenment, the European powers harnessed unprecedented technology to colonize the world, initiating a globalization of trade. Though Columbus unwittingly set foot in the Caribbean in 1492, what the West truly sought was the spices and silk of the Orient, with the British longing for tea in particular. But though Europe was eager to import luxuries from abroad, the same could not be said for the Chinese. The Qing dynasty was distrusting and largely dismissive of outsiders, holding themselves as a bastion of sophistication above else. In 1757, to deal with eager Western traders, they relegated the southern port of Canton as the sole legitimate area of international trade, which operated under strict supervision. Thus, the insatiable demand for tea and other goods in Britain fueled a growing trade deficit of silver with China. By 1797, the East India Company was £28 million in debt to China. Disgruntled investors sought to reverse this, looking for a commodity that held a high demand in China. So they turned to British-owned opium plantations in India and began to administer an influx of Indian opium into China. Though the East India Company did not directly peddle opium, they auctioned large quantities off to local middlemen or other foreign traders. These profiteers would sail to islands off the Chinese coast, where they sold the narcotic to eager Chinese traders who distributed in the mainland. Imports of opium continued to swell into the early 19th century, despite condemnations from the emperor himself, who decreed opium is poison, and a formal ban on recreational use. Traders would use opium revenue to purchase Chinese goods and leave hefty bribes for the local merchants and inspectors. By the 1830s, China was importing well over 1,000 tons of opium each year. An estimated staggering 4 to 8 million Chinese were addicted to the drug. With the situation becoming increasingly dire in China, the frustrated Diaogang Emperor appointed a hardline anti-opium viceroy, Commissioner Lin Sexu, to deal with the country's narcotic crisis. In March 1839, he arrived in Canton, arresting hundreds of corrupt merchants and confiscating thousands of opium pipes. Threatening force against foreign traders, he confiscated 20,000 chests of opium. For nearly a month, workers labored to dump the nearly 2 million pounds of opium into the ocean. Commissioner Lin is mostly remembered for his scathing address to the sovereign of England herself, Queen Victoria, in which he unapologetically attacks Britain for supporting immoral, barbarian traders who profit at the expense of Chinese people. Lin was a proud and morally righteous figure, contrary to the corrupt Canton merchants, and held the admirable position that opium was of tremendous harm to Chinese society. Indeed it was, but his methodology was brazenly overbearing and lacked tactness. He floated the suggestion of a death penalty to Emperor Daogang to all consumers and distributors of opium, but such a solution would have entailed immeasurable bloodshed. Ultimately, his uncompromising stance was a resounding reason for the disastrous First Opium War. As a result of Commissioner Lin's unexpected seizure of opium, Britain dispatched a small fleet to negotiate favorable treatment in a tactic later known as gunboat diplomacy. This was largely unbeknownst to the King government. Though the Royal Navy was undoubtedly the strongest military force at the time, none could have predicted the ease with which the British trounced the Chinese military. The British held a vast technological advantage with massive frigates and superior flintlock guns. In a series of devastating battles, such as the Battle of Chapu and the Battle of Chinkiang, Chinese casualties outnumbered the British by 100 to 1. By June of 1842, the British had captured Shanghai and seized control of the Grand Canal, paralyzing the empire's ability to distribute grain. Thus, the reluctant emperor ordered his diplomats to sign a treaty with the British at Nanjing, officially ending the war on 29 August 1842. As devastating as the war was, the Treaty of Nanjing only made matters worse, initiating what the Chinese would later refer to as the Century of Shame, being the first of a series of unequal treaties that snubbed Chinese sovereignty. It demanded repayment in the order of millions of pounds for Lin's damages, forcibly opened 4 more ports to the foreign trade, and ceded Hong Kong to the British. Yet it failed to address the issue that caused the war in the first place, the trade and legality of opium. Thus, opium remained an unresolved problem within China, as other crises racked the already frail Qing dynasty. Border regions suffered from constant instability and insurrections. The God-worshipping society, initiated by a radical Christian millenarian Hong Xiquan, upended social order in the north, engulfing the empire in a civil war. Famine and drought plagued much of the land, all the while the consumption of opium continued to rise dramatically, reaching over 4,000 tons by 1860. Meanwhile, Britain sought to renegotiate the terms of the Treaty of Nanjing, undoubtedly noting the success of gunboat diplomacy prior. They wished to formally legalize the opium trade and open all of China to trade. It was the relatively minor Arrow incident where the Chinese detained a cargo ship on suspicion of piracy, which thrust China into another costly and deadly war. Using this as a casus belli, Britain was aided by France in a campaign against China. With less than 10,000 troops and merely 15 casualties, the Anglo-French forces recaptured Canton. By 1860, the Chinese had signed the Treaty of Tientsin, which demanded several million in silver in repayment, the opening of China to foreigners, and the opening of several more trade ports. Once again, opium was not explicitly legalized, but it had become a staple part of China's economy over the years. Opium became a substitute currency in some places, and proved a reliable source of taxes for local leaders who merely went along with the national initiative against opium, but casually accepted bribes. Due to moral outrage and shifting economies, Britain no longer depended on the sale of opium within China, and gradually local farmers harnessed the demand for themselves. In 1901, a revitalized effort to suppress opium was met with opposition not from abroad, but from local farmers, retailers, and users. The antiquated Qing Empire crumbled within a mere decade from internal pressure, and local governments felt no need to quell opium use. Kuomintang rule over the Republic of China during the Nanjing decade was in large part funded by opium trafficking. It took until the bloody Chinese Civil War and Sino-Japanese War, when the Communist Party took over, for opium to be finally addressed. Chairman Mao Zedong is a polarizing figure within China, a hero to some but a criminal to others. He unified a war-torn country and rapidly industrialized a backwards economy, but he also caused the deaths of tens of millions of people during the Great Leap Forward. Much like Commissioner Lin a century prior, Mao took a hardline stance against opium. As in other facets of his regime, Mao called for swift and brutal changes. He did not reform opium use, rather he revolted against it. He forced tens of millions of users into compulsory treatment programs, executed millions of dealers, and eradicated its production within China. Afterwards, the Opium Wars were subject to Mao's revisionism, with mandated descriptions in textbooks of British atrocities. Yet such simplification ignores the corruption and societal abuse within and outside of China at the time, and ineffectually bludgeons the drug problem rather than tactfully trying to solve it. Though the neighboring Golden Triangle now serves as a hotbed for opium production, China still has a massive illegal drug trade problem. To this day, China imprisons thousands of dealers each year, and punishments for trafficking remain harsh. In 2010, British national Akmal Shaikh was executed for smuggling 4 pounds of heroin, evoking memories of the Opium Wars to some. It is not just China that has to learn from its missteps in handling opium, though in China the cost for seemingly ridding itself of opium has been human life. In the United States, the cost of a fervent late 20th century anti-drug campaign has been an incomparably high incarceration rate, with over 2 million people behind bars in 2016. Yet marijuana, a Schedule I drug punished with stringent mandatory minimums, is now legal for recreational uses in a multitude of states, and is poised for legality in several more. Nearly 50 years later, Nixon's drug war seems ineffectual as another opioid crisis racks the nation, triggered not by wealthy imperialists but greed and avarice from big pharma within. 200 years later, yet China is still at war with drugs, and humanity is still at war with opium.